Bishop T.D.Jakes. He's the head of the Potter's House in Dallas, a megachurch with more than 30,000 members. Millions more watch online.
I think it's not fun anytime, but traveling in the middle of a famine, that Jacob says, if you don't move, you're going to die.
A single photo may have changed everything. Not because it proved a crime. It didn't. There were no charges against T.D.Jakes, no court ruling, and no documented evidence of illegal conduct connected to the image. But within months, people began asking questions they had ignored for years. Questions about the mansion, the money, the celebrity friendships, the theology, and the empire built around one man. Then something even more surprising happened. The church that once looked untouchable started showing signs of strain, and the biggest question was no longer what happened in the photo. It was what had been happening behind the scenes all along. Long before people debated headlines or questioned his reputation, T.D.Jakes was simply a young preacher with a message that connected where many others could not. In the early 1980s, he began preaching in a small storefront church in West Virginia. The crowds were modest, the budget was tight, and few could have imagined what would come next. But one thing stood out from the beginning. He didn't just preach about heaven. He spoke about pain, failure, broken families, and starting over. His messages felt personal, and people listened. That connection became the foundation of everything that followed. Then came a sermon series that changed his life forever. Woman, Thou Art Loosed. What began as a message for women recovering from abuse, trauma, and heartbreak quickly became a national movement. Churches filled beyond capacity, audio recordings spread across the country, conferences attracted thousands, and his books climbed bestseller lists. For many people, T.D.Jakes wasn't simply a pastor anymore. He became a source of hope during life's hardest moments. When he founded the Potter's House in Dallas, the ministry expanded at an astonishing pace. Thousands gathered every week. Television broadcasts reached millions around the world. His influence stretched beyond churches into publishing, film, leadership events, and mainstream media. Interviews with major television hosts introduced him to audiences that rarely watched Christian programming, making him one of the most recognizable religious leaders in America. But success brought something else. The larger the ministry became, the more difficult it was to separate the man from the institution. Every sermon strengthened his influence. Every new business venture expanded his brand. Every public appearance tied the church's identity a little more closely to one person. That worked perfectly while public trust remained strong. But history has shown that when an organization becomes closely identified with a single personality, even small controversies can grow into much bigger questions. And behind the remarkable growth of T.D.Jakes' empire, critics had already begun raising concerns that most of the public never noticed. By the early 2000s, T.D.Jakes had become more than a pastor. He was one of the most recognizable faces in American Christianity. But while millions celebrated his success, another conversation was quietly growing behind the scenes. It wasn't about money. It wasn't about celebrity. It was about what he believed. Some theologians questioned Jakes' earlier connections to oneness Pentecostal teaching and whether his public explanation of the Trinity matched traditional Christian doctrine. Conferences debated it. Books were written about it. Some pastors defended him, saying his beliefs had been misunderstood. Others argued his answers still left important questions unresolved. Jakes later clarified his position publicly, but the discussion never disappeared completely. Then came another criticism. As the Potter's House expanded into a global ministry, some observers began asking whether the church was becoming too closely linked to one man's success. His best-selling books, films, leadership conferences, and media appearances introduced Christianity to millions, but they also transformed him into something few pastors had ever become, a global brand. Supporters saw this as a powerful way to reach people outside the church. Critics worried it blurred the line between ministry and business. That debate only grew louder as his success became more visible. His home, his conferences, and his influence were often presented by supporters as examples of God's blessing. Others questioned whether visible wealth could send the wrong message, especially to people struggling financially.
While Jakes rarely described himself as a prosperity gospel preacher, critics argued that parts of his message sounded similar enough to keep the debate alive. Still, none of these disagreements seriously slowed the ministry. The church continued growing. New books topped bestseller lists, conferences sold out, television audiences remained strong. For years, it seemed that every controversy faded almost as quickly as it appeared. Then the world changed. Social media gave every old sermon, every interview, and every photograph a second life. Suddenly, decades of criticism that had once stayed inside church circles were reaching millions of people with a single click. And that was only the beginning. For years, T.D.Jakes seemed to move at a pace few people could match. He preached to thousands every week, traveled across the country, wrote books, produced films, led conferences, and continued expanding one of America's most influential ministries. To many, it looked as if nothing could slow him down. But behind the scenes, time was beginning to catch up. After decades of carrying the weight of a global ministry, Jakes began speaking more openly about the importance of preparing the next generation of leadership. Like many pastors who had led large churches for decades, he faced a difficult question: what happens when the founder is no longer at the center? That question became much more urgent after he experienced a highly publicized health scare while preaching. Although he later reassured supporters and continued his ministry, the incident reminded millions that even the most influential leaders are not immune to age or physical limits. Suddenly, conversations about succession were no longer theoretical, they became immediate. Then came one of the biggest announcements in the church's history. Jakes revealed that he was preparing to hand leadership of the Potter's House to the next generation. Supporters described it as a thoughtful, long-planned transition designed to ensure the ministry would continue for decades. Others saw the timing differently. Online commentators quickly linked the announcement to recent controversies, even though no evidence showed the leadership change was caused by them. That distinction mattered. A planned succession is very different from being forced out. Yet, on social media, those differences often disappeared. Headlines became shorter, rumors spread faster, separate events were merged into a single dramatic narrative, making it difficult for many people to separate verified facts from online speculation. At the same time, the challenges facing the Potter's House were not unique. Across America, many megachurches were entering a new era. Church attendance had been changing for years. The pandemic accelerated online worship. Younger generations increasingly questioned institutions, celebrity culture, and religious authority. Ministries built during the television age were now trying to adapt to a world where every sermon clip, interview, or photograph could be shared, criticized, and replayed within minutes. For leaders who had spent decades carefully building trust, this created an entirely new reality. And just when it seemed the biggest challenges were about health and succession, another story exploded online, one that would reshape public perception almost overnight. The turning point didn't begin in a courtroom. It began on a phone screen. As federal investigations surrounding music executive Sean "Diddy" Combs dominated headlines, social media users started searching through years of old photos and videos involving celebrities, business leaders, athletes, and pastors who had crossed paths with him. Among those images were photos of T.D.Jakes at public events. Within hours, those pictures were everywhere. To be clear, no criminal charges were filed against Jakes and no public evidence linked him to any illegal activity with Combs. But on social media, context is often the first thing to disappear. A single image can become a complete story before anyone asks where it came from or what it actually shows. That was exactly what happened. Videos with dramatic titles began collecting millions of views. Some claimed Jakes had lost everything. Others suggested his ministry was collapsing behind closed doors. Many blended verified events, such as his leadership transition and previous health challenges, with speculation, presenting them as parts of one larger scandal. The result was a perfect storm. For years, Jakes had built his reputation on trust. Now that same trust was being tested in real time. Every old sermon was re-examined. Every interview was replayed.
Every friendship became a topic of debate. Supporters argued that people were rushing to judgment without evidence. Critics insisted public figures should answer difficult questions even when no wrongdoing had been established. But perhaps the biggest challenge wasn't the controversy itself. It was silence. Many viewers expected a detailed public response that would address the growing online conversation. Instead, much of the discussion continued without clear answers to satisfy everyone. That silence created space for more theories, more speculation, and even more viral content. Before long, the internet was no longer asking whether the allegations were true. It was asking why so many people believed them in the first place. Yet while millions focused on one pastor, they were missing a much bigger story. Because what was happening to T.D.Jakes wasn't happening to him alone. Across America, some of the country's most influential megachurches were facing the same invisible battle, and the outcome could reshape the future of celebrity Christianity itself. By now, it was clear that the story wasn't just about T.D.Jakes. It was about what happens when a ministry becomes inseparable from the person leading it. For decades, megachurches across America experienced incredible growth. Charismatic pastors filled massive auditoriums, television broadcasts reached millions, and ministries expanded into publishing, conferences, streaming platforms, and media companies. These leaders became more than pastors. They became public figures whose influence reached far beyond Sunday mornings. But that success came with a hidden risk. When a church's identity becomes closely tied to one personality, every challenge facing that leader can quickly become a challenge for the entire ministry. A health scare becomes a church story. A leadership transition becomes a national headline. Even an old photograph can trigger questions about an institution built over decades. The Potter's House was not immune to that reality. Like many churches after the pandemic, it faced a changing world. More people chose to watch services online instead of attending in person. Younger generations became increasingly skeptical of celebrity culture, including celebrity pastors. Trust in public institutions had already been declining, and churches found themselves navigating the same environment as businesses, universities, and governments. That didn't mean the Potter's House had stopped serving its community. The church continued holding worship services, outreach programs, educational initiatives, and charitable work. Many members remained deeply committed, arguing that headlines often ignored the ministry's impact on families, neighborhoods, and people in need. Supporters believed years of service should not be erased by viral speculation or misleading narratives. Still, perception was becoming harder to manage. Every week, new content creators revisited old controversies. Clips were edited into shorter videos. Headlines became more dramatic. Nuance disappeared. A carefully planned leadership transition was described by some as a collapse. Health challenges became signs of institutional failure. Rumors spread faster than official statements could respond. The question was no longer whether the internet could shape public opinion. It already had. The real question was whether T.D.Jakes' legacy would ultimately be defined by decades of ministry or by a single chapter that unfolded in the age of viral content. And the answer may depend on something far bigger than one church. Long before the controversy, T.D.Jakes had already secured a place in modern Christian history. His books reached millions of readers. His sermons gave hope to people facing addiction, grief, broken relationships, and personal failure. Through conferences, leadership training, films, and television, he helped shape how an entire generation viewed faith. Even many people who disagreed with parts of his theology acknowledged his ability to communicate difficult subjects in ways that resonated with everyday families. That legacy hasn't disappeared. The Potter's House continues to hold weekly services, support outreach programs, and invest in community initiatives. Ministries inspired by Jakes are still active around the world. Many pastors continue to point to his preaching as a major influence on their own calling. To his supporters, these are the things that should define his life's work, not a handful of viral headlines. But critics see the story differently.
They argue that the controversy exposed a larger problem inside celebrity-driven ministries. When one leader becomes the public face of an entire church, accountability becomes more complicated. Every personal decision, every public appearance, and every unanswered questions can affect thousands of people who have placed their trust in that leader. Whether fair or unfair, those expectations only grow as influence increases. The debate is no longer just about T.D.Jakes, it's about the future of leadership itself. Can a ministry remain healthy when its identity is built around one personality? Can churches prepare for the next generation without creating confusion or division? And in an age where every moment is recorded, clipped, and shared online, is it even possible for any public figure to control their own story? Those questions became even more important as leadership at the Potter's House began shifting to the next generation. For supporters, it represented continuity and careful planning. For skeptics, it marked the end of an era. Both sides agreed on one thing: the ministry was entering a new chapter unlike any it had faced before. And that raises one final question. If this story was never really about losing a mansion or a church, then what was it actually about? So, did T.D. Jakes really lose his mansion, his reputation, and his church in 1 year? The answer is more complicated than the headlines suggest. Despite countless videos and social media posts repeating the claim, there is no verified public evidence that Jakes lost ownership of his Texas home. His leadership transition at the Potter's House was publicly presented as a planned succession, not as a forced removal. And while his reputation undoubtedly faced intense public scrutiny, reputation isn't measured by a court document or a single news headline. It is shaped by what people choose to believe over time. That may be the biggest lesson in this entire story. For decades, T.D. Jakes built a ministry around faith, leadership, and hope. He inspired millions, influenced churches across the world, and became one of the most recognizable voices in modern Christianity. At the same time, his enormous success brought extraordinary visibility. Every achievement was celebrated, every criticism was magnified, and every controversy became global news within hours. Whether someone views him as a visionary leader or a symbol of celebrity Christianity, one reality is impossible to ignore. The rules have changed. Today's pastors don't just lead congregations, they lead under constant public observation. Every sermon is recorded, every interview is archived, every public appearance can be clipped into a 15-second video and shared with millions of people who may never hear the full story. In that environment, perception often becomes as influential as evidence. Perhaps that's why this story resonates far beyond one church in Dallas. Across America, ministries are asking difficult questions about leadership, transparency, succession, and accountability. Can churches thrive without being built around a single personality? Can decades of service withstand the speed of online judgment? And how should audiences separate verified facts from stories designed to attract clicks? Those questions may shape the next generation of churches far more than any single controversy ever could. Because in the end, this wasn't simply the story of T.D. Jakes. It was the story of what happens when faith, influence, media, and the internet collide. And that story is still unfolding. Somewhere, another ministry is growing. Another pastor is becoming a household name. Another empire is being built. The only question is whether anyone has learned the lessons from this one, or whether the next headline is already writing itself.